Hey, welcome everybody to our third episode of Comprehend This podcast. Okay, today's confession time. Who here has ever killed an entire class period conjugating verbs, only to have your students forget them 5 minutes later? Yeah, same. That's why today we're blowing up Grammar Grill Graveyard with two of my favorite rebel teachers, Spanish teacher Chelsea Woodruff and French teacher Tara Ellsley. They're spilling their best hacks for sneaking grammar into a CI classroom without the charts, drills, or tears. If you've ever wondered, am I even teaching grammar if no one's crying? This one's for you. Stick around and we'll be right back after this short message. Ever feel like you're clinging to the edge of your teacher planner, just hoping today's lesson magically appears? Enter the CI Survival Kit, a monthly membership made for teachers who love comprehensible input, but also love not reinventing the wheel every Sunday night. Each month, you get fresh, ready to use lessons, time saving tools, and just enough structure to keep your teaching life together. No stress, no guilt, just monthly help from someone who gets it. Sign up at imm.us/survival and let the survival kit do the heavy lifting for once.
Welcome to Comprehend This, real talk for real language teachers. No drills, no dry theory, just honest stories, practical ideas, and a reminder you're not alone in the CI trenches. Let's dive in.
Hello, and I'm joined here by Chelsea and Tara. How are we doing this morning?
Great.
Très bien.
Très bien. My French is very rusty. I have some French, but very, very rusty. And Chelsea's a Spanish teacher, so right in my ballpark. And then I also speak German. That was my major in college. So today we're talking grammar. So I don't know about any of you, but I learned most of my English grammar from language classes. I did not understand the difference between who and whom and direct object pronouns and indirect object pronouns until I took German, where they took it to a fine art. They have even more than they have who, whom, and then they have another whom. They have a different kind of whom than we do. So I learned all that kind of stuff from there. And I loved learning grammar, but I have to be honest, I didn't learn grammar to use grammar through grammar rules. I knew all the grammar rules and I could recite them. I can't anymore because I stopped using them, but I could back then when I was a kid learning the languages. But that's not where I ever picked up my grammar rules. It was much more from exposure and how to use them and how to implement them in a natural way. But I loved grammar and I loved teaching grammar. And when I taught native speakers, whoa, I loved going right into depth because they needed to learn the grammar in a more different way because they are already fluent and they needed to focus on writing and reading. Those were areas so I could work on it. And I just loved teaching that. But it was a big bomb in a regular language class. As a kid, you ask the kids what they want to learn the first day, they're like, no one ever says, I want to learn all the grammar rules. They just say they want to learn the language, they want to speak the language, they want to speak with their friends, or they want to learn the swear words. Those are always the common things that kids always ask about. So let's go ahead and get started and let's talk about how did you used to teach grammar when you guys started? Whoever would like to go first?
I'll take it.
Okay.
So I have a weird starting story because I learned Brazilian Portuguese by immersion. When I was just out of high school, I worked for Continental Airlines for 14 years. And I was an international government sales rep. So I was traveling to different countries and helping their government promote airline travel. So I lived in Brazil and was literally, I mean, this was 2002, 2003, carrying around my dictionary and my verb conjugation guide, the 500 verbs, if you remember, and trying to learn how to communicate without any class whatsoever. I came back to the US in 2003 and there were no Portuguese majors at any of my local colleges. So I was like, okay, well, Spanish, I guess. So I took my first Spanish class when I was a junior in college, and it was all drill and kill, all of it. But I loved the language aspects of it. In fact, I one of my majors was linguistics, and so I was loving studying and comparing the languages as I tried to learn Spanish. And I got complete 4.0 in my Spanish classes, aced every single writing thing, and I still couldn't sustain a 1 minute conversation in Spanish. So that was my intro to Spanish, but I did graduate with a degree in Spanish and linguistics and still couldn't communicate. So I eventually created my own immersion situation in Mexico. I went and lived in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and studied at the Universidad Internacional de Lingüística, teaching master's level courses in English for their English language learners and in exchange learning Spanish. But as far as teaching goes, I got my teaching license. I was uh, teaching, but I was not having a teaching license. And when I did my student teaching, my very first mentor teacher was a TPRS teacher. So that was my indoctrination by fire.
Awesome. It's funny because I used to work for an airline too when I was going through college. I worked for Northwest and then United Airlines back in the day. So they have a little commonality in that. Interesting. Thank you for sharing. What about you, Tara?
I'm very similar to Chelsea that I started French because I didn't want to do what everyone else did, so I picked French. In seventh grade, drill and kill. I took it seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th grade, and then I was able to go apply my skills when I went to, as an exchange student, I traveled to Switzerland and I lived with the family for a summer. So I arrived with my 4 years of French, and I realized very quickly I was not able to say anything. I had high A's in my classes. I could conjugate all the verbs. My adjectives agreed. Everything was perfect, but I couldn't say anything. So I, through immersion, similar to Chelsea, learned a lot. Yet then, when I went through my teacher training program in college and even my student teaching, I reverted to what I knew, which was teaching the drills and grammar. That's all I knew. So it was, we're going to learn this verb, and here are the forms, and then I'm going to quiz you on the forms. And that was my first 20 some years teaching. And then I discovered CI around 2019. It was right before COVID. And that changed everything. I started getting my feet wet just a little bit. And boy, has it been life-changing for me and for my students. And I'll share my breakthrough moment now, which is when a student said to me, I don't know how we're learning French. We just kind of know it. And I said, all right, I have done my job.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I have a weirdly weird experience too because I went into learning languages kicking and screaming. My mother said there's two classes. She didn't care what I took in high school, but two classes were required. One was typing, and one was a foreign language. And she didn't care which foreign language I took, but I was taking a foreign language. And I took Spanish 1 in 10th grade and had a wonderful Spanish teacher, Senorita Wiley. I know that the last she's Mexican, but her last name, and she wasn't married, and so but her last name was definitely not a Hispanic last name. And I learned so much through her. And then they stuck in my classroom an exchange student, kind of a weird exchange student. His name was Carlos Alfonso Rueda Peña from Colombia, and what he first of all he put his initials as carp, which I told him that's an ugly fish. You don't want to do that. And then he did not want to learn English. He was only here because his family was in the drug business and he had to leave the country for his safety. And his goal was to go back as soon as possible. And he took the first half of the day in intensive English classes. And then the second half of the day, he followed me in my classes. And I was supposed to interpret for him, but I was level one. How was I supposed to interpret? So I carried this mini dictionary around because he was not learning English. I had to do all the work, and I'm looking up every word. And I remember the first time that I used the verb gustar, which is like plaisir. So we don't have a verb like ame in Spanish. We've got, it's always the reverse. It's the plaisir version. And so I used to conjugate it like a regular verb. Gusto, gustas, gusta. And when I finally got it right, he was like applauding me. He was like so happy. I just remember that moment. But then it got really awkward because he didn't know how to exist in America because he didn't speak English. And we weren't in a Hispanic area. I was in a suburb of Detroit in Michigan. I mean, we have some Hispanics, but certainly not like if you go to Southern California or Arizona or New York or Florida. So communicating in Spanish was not an easy thing. And so I had to follow him around after school too. And we became friends, and he got a girlfriend. And I remember when she got a note in his locker, and she spoke English and didn't speak Spanish, and he spoke Spanish and didn't speak English. And so I was that awkward third wheel interpreter, and I translated the first thing that he wrote to her wrong because Spanish, the verb for I want is also I love, like in a playful kind of way. And I said, he said, I want you, which high school student, you go right to that thing. And it was kind of a weird thing. But I was that interpreter and I had to go on dates with them and be their interpreter. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so awkward. And then at the time, Madonna's song La Isla Bonita came out, and it's half in Spanish and half in English, and so that was like their little love song because it was like both those. But it was so awkward. So that's where I learned my Spanish was from that, not from the classroom because it was all the grammar and vocabulary. I knew it all, but being able to speak it like you said was a whole different ball game. And then my Spanish teacher encouraged me to take German and French. So my junior year, I took Spanish and German, and my senior year, I took Spanish, German, and French. And I continued that in college until I got scolded by um, the college saying you have to take your general ed because all I was doing was taking language classes. And said if you don't take your general ed and get them done, then we're going to have to kick you out. You got to get your general ed done first. And teaching languages, I mean, some of those classes only came once every 5 years, so you had to take them when they came up. So I had to let French go, and I turned my major from Spanish to German when I moved to California because in California, Spanish majors were a dime a dozen, and this way I could compete more with a German, not realizing that finding a German teaching job by the time I graduated from college was nearly impossible. It was already on the way out at that point. Um, and I was lucky when I started school. I know people who've listened before have heard this story already. When I started teaching, I started on an emergency permit. I taught, I was hired 2 months into the school year, or maybe a month, or maybe it was probably a month in the school year. It was October, and it was for the overflow students. So they realized they had more enrollment than they expected, and they only needed a part-time teacher for 2 periods, but they had no benefits and nobody wanted it. So I became the sucker and I took it. I had no teaching experience. I had not gone to teaching school yet. I walked in there. Bevan was a student of mine at that time, and he said it was Spanish too. And I hadn't spoken Spanish in a while because I had majored in German. So all my classes were in German the last few years. So I was really out of date. And he said, you walked into that classroom like a scared rabbit that day. And he was not wrong. I was terrified. The 15, 16-year-old kids terrified me. I was terrified by them, literally. And then I taught like you did, the way I was taught. The drilling kit, teach the vocabulary, go through the textbook. Let's do all the grammar exercises. Oh, and then we can find more in the workbooks. Let's go and do those too. And then we went through that and go to chapter 2. And I was extremely bored, and so were my students. They were falling asleep. And I don't know who fell asleep first, me or them, but it was really bad. It was a really torturous first semester. And I'm like, there is no way that I can do this for 30 years. There was no way. So, come the end of the first semester, I found Blaine Ray and TPRS, and I studied everything I could over the winter break. I had no training. I just joined the More TPRS list, which was the predecessor of the Facebook group that we have now. I got his books. I read them. He had videos because with YouTube did not exist back in 2001. So I bought his videos and watched his videos of him teaching in the classroom and watched all of those. And then come second semester, I went whole hog. I went right in and jumped right in, and I did it horribly. It was horrible. But it was better than what I was doing, and my kids were more energetic, and I was like, oh, maybe I could do this for 30 years now. And I made a 180 degrees from that first semester, that second semester, and I haven't looked back. I've been using CI since 2001, the second semester of that year. So technically it was 2002, but January of that time, second semester. And as I said, I have not looked back at all. And my kids know a lot of the grammar. I don't even remember the rules anymore, to be quite honest. It's been so long since I've taught them, like the imperfect and preterite rules. I learned from Susie Gross a quick way to do it. She taught French and a little bit of Spanish, and her rule, her very simplified rule, works for 80% of the time. And so I've used it. That's what I've taught my kids. We go through when we talk about the imperfect and the preterite. If it's an action, it's in the preterite or the passé composé, and if it's a description, it's in the imperfect. And so I always ask the kids, is that a verb in the action or is it a verb of a description? And we go through that as we do. It was we analyze that way so that they learn it that way. It's much simpler than thinking about, did the past action start in the past and then end in the past? Or did it start in the past and continue? Who thinks that way? Nobody thinks that way at all. And so those grammar drills just didn't happen. And I'm always looking for ways to simplify any kind of rule, because I'm in a school now where I've got to teach from a textbook, and I have to teach the content of the grammar rules, but I find simple ways to do it. Like my adjective agreements, I go, the adjective has to rhyme with the noun, which works for most of the time. Chicos buenos, chicas buenas, it rhymes with the noun. And the kids can get that a little bit better than making it's got to agree in subject, it's got to agree in gender, and it's got to agree in singular or plural. That doesn't make sense to them. So it's just a much easier way. So I'm always looking for ways to simplify. But we learned as teachers a long time ago, telling kids to one thing does not stick in their heads. You have to have them, you have to show them through modeling and examples, and then they can do it themselves. And so that's what CI is. We show them through models with listening and reading of how the grammar works, and they pick it kind of like through osmosis, the same way we did it in our first languages. So that was my experience. Um, Anybody want to tackle what made you shift away from drills and charts and worksheets?
Scott, I'll jump in because something you mentioned. I actually started Spanish in college and I learned all the grammar. And I still can't speak in the preterite because I can never remember the endings. And I think now, 30 some years later, if I had learned CI Spanish, I would be able to speak. So I think kind of all of these things came together at once, like I said, around 2019 for me. And I have a theater background. So I started with probably the worst thing to start with because it's so hard, story asking. That is not where to start. I didn't know how to structure it, scaffold it. I didn't know how much to prepare in advance. But some good came from it because there's always good. And we created some characters that actually endured through the next 3 years just from the story asking. So I would advise someone to do story asking later start with the smaller things. I love the storytelling, and I have students remember my stories. Some of them are personal stories, some of them are made up, very cultural stories. Um, but I think just the fact that I really can't, and I live in South Florida, I'm around Spanish all the time, but what's up with the preterite? I don't know. I just can't get it.
And in Spain, they don't use it. They're like French. They use the passé composé. So they use the present perfect in Spain over the preterite, just like French does.
Oh, like a hecho or something like
Yep,
that.
exactly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they tend to use that more often than the preterite in Spain, and in Latin America, they use the preterite more than the present perfect. But yeah, it's
No,
interesting.
I can only speak about the present and the future in Spanish.
That's so funny. What about you, Chelsea?
Well, so I said that my mentor teacher while I was student teaching was a TPRS teacher. So during that semester, I went to National TPRS conference. I met you. I had your manila envelope with all of the printing of the immediate immersion teaching guides and the CDs, and with the movies. I guess they were DVDs. And I also met Mira Canyon and Karen Rowan and Blaine. I actually took lessons with Blaine. That was in 2011, I think. And so, and I did the Russian track because I knew that Russian had nothing to do with anything I did. And I wanted to experience that TPRS experience. And I came away from that track feeling like I could speak Russian, although I never have again. And it was pretty awesome. So I started, but I have a kind of funny first job story. So my curriculum design and development teacher for my master's degree was assistant principal at a high school, and she didn't interview anybody else. She hired me right out of my class with my before I got my teaching license. But by the time I actually arrived for the job, there had been some sort of scandal, and the administration had been separated and told that they could not have any contact with each other, and a whole new administration had been brought in. Nobody at the school knew I was coming, not a
Oh,
one. And I was brought in as a fourth Spanish teacher full time to a very dedicated worksheet. Everybody's on the same worksheet on the same day, Spanish department. And I only lasted there 2 years. They pretty much despised me and made it very clear that I wasn't wanted because they did not want any kind of innovation, not a bit. The lead, the Spanish department head was a double dipper who was in her 43rd year of teaching. She had retired and then came back so she could draw two salaries.
oh,
And um, she wanted it to work the way it had worked for the past 43 years, and everybody was to get in line with her. So,
hmm.
and I did TPRS, and even missing half of one semester because I got breast cancer my second year of teaching. My students outperformed hers on the end of year exams by 25%. So I was like, well, if I could get through my first and second year teaching in that environment and still show a 25% greater communication skill amongst my students, I was onto something,
Yeah,
even if I was doing it horribly.
yeah,
I didn't have any mentors. I didn't have any support. I was out of state from where my mentor teacher had been. So it was an adventure.
yeah. Then Blaine always says doing TPRS badly is still better than doing grammar instruction greatly. And I think it's very, very true because very few kids, it's so funny. The statistic, I don't know where the statistic came from, but that 4% of language learners learn from the grammar translation method. But when you figure that out and you multiply that out by to your 30 kids in your class, that's one kid. And if you think about that and in your evaluation, if you were only teaching to one out of your 30 kids in your class, I don't think your evaluation would be very good. Um, so I don't know why more teachers don't do something like this, which is much more conducive to the way the brain thinks. And people say I can't learn a language, and they're absolutely right. Nobody has learned a language. We've all acquired at least one. Even the most severely of special needs students have acquired at least one, unless there's some really bad brain damage or something. But even the severely mentally retarded, those kids can still speak in their native language to some degree, and especially can understand it. So nearly everybody can acquire a language, and if you can acquire one, you can acquire two. And it's not that you can't, it's the way that you're being taught that language that makes that difference, because it is a night and day from, you may know every grammar rule and every vocab word, but if you can't put them together in sentences, what's the point? And I always equate it to like the difference between learning to drive a car and learning to repair a car. They're not mutually exclusive, but you don't need to know one to know the other. You can learn both of them, or you can learn just one of them and just do fine. You don't need to know how to build a car to drive it, and you don't need to know how to drive a car to build it. And not necessarily knowing how to build a car does not make you a better driver, and knowing how to drive a car doesn't make you necessarily a better builder of a car. So they're related, and I think that's how languages are kind of like. Knowing all the grammar rules, knowing all the vocabulary is like building that car, and it doesn't really help you in the actual speaking of the language part of it. It's about the language, or it's the language, and they're not necessarily the same thing. Because if you go to a native speaker and ask them for the grammar rules, most of them can't tell you what the grammar rules are, you know? And although they know, all of us know tens of thousands of words in our native language, we only use on a regular basis around 1,800 to 2,000. That's our active vocabulary that actually comes out of our mouth. I call it, that's your speaking vocabulary, and then your reading vocabulary is so much bigger that you understand what those words mean, but they never come out of your mouth. It's like the words like behoove. How many people actually use the word behoove? But most of us, a lot of us know what that word means if we read it, but it's just not a word that comes out of your mouth very often. So that's the kind of big difference there. Now, I will say it was more of a, for me, it was more of a logistical reason why I went away from the drills and charts and worksheets. Because I told you I did just whatever teacher taught me. I went through and I gave them every exercise in the book and every exercise in the workbook. Because we were told we paid for these dang workbooks, we got to use them. And we paid for them every year because they were the disposable kind. They were supposed to write in them, and they had them write in them, and then we rebought them we had a subscription, I think, the way they did it. And so every year we got a certain number of ones every year. So we were expected to use them since we paid for them. And I gave them to my kids, and I would bring home this stack of papers every night to grade. And I'm like, I can't keep up with this. Because I only had that first year, I only had 2 classes. So we're talking 60 papers a night, which was nothing compared to teaching full time, where you have 5 to 6 classes that you're teaching. I was only having to grade 60 papers, but they were doing like 5 to 6 exercises a day. And I was going through and grading them and marking them and putting the right accents on them. And I was like spending 2 to 3 hours a night after work doing this. And I commuted. I was about a 45-minute drive to and from school every day. So I had my 7 hours of teaching, my 2-hour commute, and then come home and do 3 to 4 hours a night. I was like, there's no way that I can keep up with this work at all. So I had to find a way to limit. So that was kind of my shift away a little bit. And then fast forward a few years, and I was teaching in a different school district, and we were as a specialty school, and I won't go into all the thing, but we were a block schedule, and math and English thought that I know we don't meet every day, but you're going to have enough homework that covers you every day. And so our principal was like, we've got to find a way to limit the homework for these kids, because I was teaching in Nevada, and Nevada does districts differently than most states. They don't do them by neighborhood or city, they do them by county. So the entire southern cone of Nevada, from Arizona all the way to California, was one school district. And I could have one student who was on the border of Arizona and Nevada, and I could have another student who was on the border of California and Nevada, and they're commuting 2 hours each way. So we were saying there's got to be a way to limit this homework, because by the time they come home every night, they were overwhelmed. So the World Language Department volunteered not to give homework. And so we stopped giving homework, and guess what? The sky did not fall. And guess what? The grades actually went up. Not because they weren't getting enough practice, but because the practice they were getting was more authentic in the classroom, and their grades weren't being lowered by them not doing homework, which is what happens because when you get like a 30-40% turn-in rate on average from homework on time and all that kind of stuff. So it was actually eye-opening for me. And then when I thought about it in real life, I'm like, homework? Yeah, nobody likes getting extra work to do after they're done being paid. So, when we work an 8-hour shift, teachers are different, but a normal person who works a 9 to 5, they don't have to go home and then do work afterwards. They're not expected to do that. Or even worse, expected to do work on their vacation. But a lot of teachers would give homework or projects to do over winter break or over spring break for them. Can you imagine if your job told you, oh, it's winter break, you're on your winter vacation, I know you're going to Hawaii, but can you get this done while you're there, and we're not going to pay you extra for that? We would tell them where to go with that kind of thing. And so I thought about that with kids as well. They put in their 6 or 7 hours, and they need to have time to be kids because they can't get that time back. Once they become an adult, that their child time is gone. And so they needed time to bond with their families and do family time and hang out with their friends and just be kids. So I was all about, plus it was less work for me to grade. Again, very logistical and very selfish on my part, but it worked to my advantage. So that was kind of my whole way of getting away from, the drills and the charts and the worksheets, because my kids just never retained them and it never really worked. They could fill in all those worksheets incredibly well and get good grades on them, but again, they couldn't write or speak the language. And so what was the point? Since that was supposed to be the stepping stone to fluency and they weren't getting fluency, then I'm like, that's a waste of my and their time.
So I wanted to say, because Utah does their districts the same way. So I live in Salt Lake City. Our district is the entire Salt Lake Valley. Davis County is a whole district. Utah County is a whole district. But they are just now in this year, the voters did a referendum to start breaking up school districts. So, but so I get it. I've had as many as 260 students in a semester. Teaching Spanish. Right now I have 250 students, grades K through 8. I teach one kindergarten, one first grade, one second grade, one third grade, fourth, fifth, all the way up to 8. So I don't have a classroom. I go from classroom to classroom and come in and teach Spanish. And I love it. It is so much better than having my own classroom and having them come to me, because I cannot carry all that stuff. And I have no posters that I can put on the wall. I actually tried my very first day at this school to create a word wall that I could roll up and take with me, and it was a nightmare. And I was like, nope, nope, we're not doing this. So I write my vocabulary up on the board with each classroom I go into, and everything is sans paper, no paper, because I can't. I have 250 students, and I only get that 45 minutes with them. So I started doing novel theater. And I will tell you that even my kindergartners love novel theater. And we sing songs and we play games and we do all kinds of stuff other than typical Spanish work. And one of the things that I've noticed, and it's been over years, is that the kids who are on IEPs because they can't read in English, and the kids who are on IEPs because they can't write in English, they absolutely love novel theater. And when they get excited and they get engaged, then the rest of the class kind of follows suit because here's the kid who's always been the class clown because he can't follow along. And he's going, me, I know that sentence. I know that sentence. You know what I mean? And it's wonderful.
Awesome. That's so great. That is. It is. I mean, CI really does reach to so many students and so many different types of students. In my first school that I taught in, they kept putting all the special needs students in my class. And technically, I should have had a parapro at that point because I had more special needs students in my class than I had regular ed students in my class. But they kept doing it because my kids were learning. The special needs kids were actually getting better grades in my class than they were in a traditional language class that they had to do textbook in. And I was more, maybe because I was a beginning teacher, I was more sympathetic to them. So I would listen to them and adapt to them a little bit more than I would than a more veteran teacher is like, yeah, I'm kind of over these kids already, either live up to it or get out because it was an academic class and you didn't have to take this class and this is a college prep class and if you're not going to college, then why are you in that kind of thing. The school was always geared towards that AP exam, and they didn't really care about the kids, whether they were regular ed or special ed, who weren't on that path to taking the AP test because they were all about the AP test. Our school, 94% of our school went to either USC or UCLA. Um, Almost everybody went to college, and we were 80% Asian school, with most of the Asians being fresh off the plane. They immigrated to go to school here, so they weren't even Americanized. They weren't raised in America. They just came here for high school type of a thing. So very different atmosphere, but I think the way we teach with CI, it just reaches all levels of kids, and kids who struggle in some aspects of academia don't struggle in our class because we teach it just in a whole different way that actually is very brain receptive. It's brain adaptive. And so I really appreciate that about it. And it makes my job so much easier because we can have fun and learn the language and not have to do all the school stuff. And the biggest thing my kids do, and they say, we didn't learn anything all this year. And they say that because it doesn't look like school to them. We do stories, we act out, we sing, we do all this stuff, and we don't have a lot of book work, we don't have a lot of homework, we don't have a lot of writing work, and so they're like, we're not doing anything school-like, so how could we possibly be learning? And then they'll come back to me a couple years later and say, I'm working in the mall, and this lady didn't know how to speak English, and I had to sell her something, and I did it. I helped her through, and I'm like, but remember when you said you never learned anything in my class? So it's kind of funny. They just don't realize it's coming in almost like osmosis. They're just not realizing because it doesn't look like school. And I think that's a big win for us that we can actually have fun. And yes, I can show a Disney movie in my classroom and it's in my curriculum and it's in the standards to do so. Where in math, showing a Disney movie is, just being a lazy day because it's not in their curriculum. There's nothing in there. But we're supposed to use, authentic resources, and showing them a Disney movie in Spanish or French or German or Mandarin is an authentic resource. It's in the language and they're seeing it and listening it. And it's really great when I get to show Nemo at Finding Nemo at the end of the year in my Spanish 1 class, and they understand about 80% because Finding Nemo's got really low language level, and they know a lot of it by the end of the year, and they go, I understood a lot of that. I know the subtitles were up there, but I didn't read them very often. I kind of knew what was going on because it's one of those the movies I found that is so low level in English even that the kids can understand it at the end of level 1, and it's kind of an amazing thing. But we can do anything in our classroom, and so we're not stuck to, like math, demonstrating the math problem, having them work on it independently, giving them homework, grading the homework, that same cycle all the time. We can do things that are so different, and that's what makes our job much more fun, I think.
Scott, can I?
So I know that we
Oh,
kind
sorry.
of avoid themed units that are all focused around the vocabulary. But one of my favorite activities, still to this day, and it works every single grade, kindergarten all the way up through high school, is the clothing unit. I do the clothing unit because what I do is I have like 3 giant Rubbermaid totes full of donated clothing, and we do fashion shows, or we do relay races where they have to dress a person based on a series of, like, a small story where it describes the character, or we will do like I said, the novel theater for whatever novel we're reading. They get to dress up in the clothes, but they have to name them, and they have to describe the person. If sometimes they dress somebody else, but they're describing the person as they do it. And the kids just love it.
Awesome. What
Love
were you going to
that.
say, Tara?
So going back to, you mentioned the AP. I've been teaching AP French since 1999, and they shifted the exam in, I think, 2013. And for 12 years, I have had 100% passage rate on the AP exam. Well, thank you. My students are amazing.
Mhm.
What I think is interesting about that is when I shifted to CI, my scores did not change. So I have been questioned, challenged, criticized by other AP language teachers saying, well, that won't prepare students for AP, but it can. And it has. I mean, I have the results to prove that. So, yeah, I'm still a big fan of CI in the advanced levels. It can absolutely be done. And it creates, I think it just builds on the momentum that is established in the lower levels.
And I
I
can't
taught,
Oh, go ahead,
sorry,
Chelsea.
I taught AP at one of the high schools I taught at, totally in CI. I used novels like Vida y Muerte and La Mara Salvatrucha. And I'll tell you, it never occurred to me teaching in Arizona that some of my students were in MS-13. It never even occurred to me that this was their life until I had a 6'2" football player break out in heaving sobs during class and run out to the bathroom because his parents had been murdered by the MS-13 gang. And he was living with somebody like a foster family. And it was only after that. But I will say that those kids in that class came together as emotional support in a way I've never seen any other class do, because of that mistake that I made. Like, I had read the book, I knew what the book was about, but culturally, I was so white and disconnected from the city I was living in that I didn't even realize that this was a thing in my city. And that was a wake up call for me. But the discussions we were able to have because of that book were just incredible. And so I do tell people, when you're getting up into 4 NAP and you're discussing literature, and we read Aura. I don't know if you've ever read Aura, but it's a book written from the perspective of a person who has multiple personality disorder. And so in AP, when you're talking about analytical literature and you have to break down what's going on, it's fabulous for that in CI because you're trying to figure out which personality and which person she is in this situation and whether it really happened or didn't. And it was amazing for me teaching that AP class because instead of basing it just on the AP syllabus, we had the literature that they had to read and turned that into the CI.
And I was going to mention years ago, Blaine used to quote this, and I don't remember the exact numbers, I can't tell you. But after level 1, using totally TPRS, he gave his kids the AP exam after the first year of level 1. And they didn't score stellarly. They weren't getting 4s and 5s, but the majority of them hit 3s after 1 year. And so it definitely can be used in the upper levels. The problem that we have, and now we have call it CI, and TPRS is only one aspect under the big umbrella of CI. But back when I started, that's all we had. But what's when we train people in TPRS, they always show it from the beginner perspective. So we only see the demos of a language nobody understands and how to do it on day 1 with kids who know no language, but they rarely ever do a demo of how to do it in an advanced class where there's already language under the belt. So there's always been this mentality that it's great for beginning students, but you can't do it in upper levels. And my only shift between upper levels and lower levels is I do less stories in upper levels because the higher grammar is harder. You can't, unless you're using dialogue a lot in the stories, it's hard to get in subjunctive or future tense because telling a story in future tense is awkward. But having dialogue in the future tense is natural, but there's not enough of it to get the repetitions. So discussions are or I call conversations, is where I put my emphasis in upper levels. I do it in my lower levels too, but that's my main thrust in my upper levels is conversations because I can ask, what do your parents want you to do at home and get the subjunctive in? Or what will you be doing this weekend to get the future tense in? Or do you want to do as an adult? Get the future tense in. I can get it in much more naturally in a conversation to hit those grammar points that I've got to talk about. Conditional is really easy. What would you do? Would you rather? Those fun little games that kids like to do. Is really I can do it in the target language. By the time they're in level 3 and 4 in AP, you can do it in those levels and they get it much more, and it's less stories, but it's still very possible to be able to do. So I congratulate you, Tara, on doing that with your APs and showing them that it's not I don't know how to say, CI isn't a watered down version of teaching a language. It's teaching a language because if grammar and vocab actually worked after the gender reveal party that babies have, they would have a shower and people would just be giving them different forms of dictionaries and different forms of grammar books. And they would be, instead of reading bedtime stories, they're reading grammar rules at night. No parent in the history of humankind has ever done that. And yet, parents are the perfect language teachers without any training. They have a 100% success rate. They don't have a failure rate. And we go to school and they try to teach our instincts out of us. And I remember Hayun Lu always says, don't be a language teacher, be a language parent. And I really like that And she goes, if you wouldn't do it as a parent, then don't do it as a teacher. So if you wouldn't, go over grammar rules with your child, then don't go over grammar rules with your student. And I remember even a native speaker woman, she says, yeah, my kid failed out of Spanish too. And I already knew why he failed out of Spanish too. He was a fluent Spanish speaker, but she didn't understand. She's a Spanish teacher and she didn't understand why her kid failed out of Spanish too. And I'm like, well, what do they focus on in Spanish too? And she's like, I don't get your ass about grammar. What's the big grammar push in level two? She goes, well, it's the preterite versus imperfect. And I'm like, yep, that's what it is in level two. Every textbook, that's what they cover in level two. And I said, could trying to think, could you, could your child do the imperfect and preterite before walking into Spanish two? She goes, yes, perfectly. I said, so then what happened in level two that destroyed his Spanish? And she didn't get it. I said, they taught him the rules. So now he's over analyzing everything that he's saying and trying to apply rules and trying to override his instinct. And that caused him to mess all of that up. And so the rules just kind of get in the way. And I think that's really an important thing that, nobody learned from the rules. When did they introduce rules in English? Late elementary, once the kids are already fluent, because they're now trying to make pretty their language. But our kids don't get that in 4 years. They are not going to be at that level of fluency of where a kid in their native language would be in upper elementary. So we're not working on making the language pretty. We're just working on making language. So we are at that basic level, and so we don't get to that grammar level. And I think that's a really important point. And Senorita Thornton had this to say. Thanks for saying that TPRS can be done at higher levels. Our discussion in my district is, well, that's good for level one. It won't work for higher levels. And that is absolutely not true, as you've seen demonstrated here. I have not taught AP, generally because AP is a certificated class, and once one teacher does it, they keep it till they retire. And right now we have a native speaker who teaches that at my current school, but I've taught levels 1 through 3, and I've used TPRS exclusively and been able to get my kids to move on. Now we're coming to the end, so I want to just get a couple more questions in here. Do either of you have a go-to trick for making grammar stick without the drills? What works for you?
I do.
Okay, go ahead.
I focus all of my first semester of Spanish 1 and Spanish 2 on yo and two. Students are never more interested in anybody than themselves. And so I have magnets. They're like half sheet magnets with all of your super or sweet 16 verbs in yo form. And I just throw it up on the board and I say, okay, tango. Yo tango, pelo corto. Tú tienes pelo largo. Yo soy rubia, pero tengo pelo liso. Tienes pelo rizado. And we just work stories all around themselves. By the time we're done with first term, they are writing usually 5 paragraphs of a personal story about themselves. Because I just focus, yo, too. They get that I'm asking you, you're responding I. And so I don't, and I know that Blaine said when I was learning that you shouldn't shelter conjugation. But I really have found that works well for my students to really shelter the type of conjugations that you have in a back and forth conversation. And I just throw the magnet with the verb up on the board and then we go from there.
And the way I interpreted when he said not shelter grammar was that in level one, you only use the present tense. And then in level two, you only use the past tense. And in level three, you throw everything else at them. And you see textbooks making the mistake because they teach the preterite first at the end of level one, and a textbook comes the preterite, so they'll write things in the preterite that should be in the imperfect because they haven't taught the imperfect yet. Where I interpreted it was use the grammar that you have to use to make yourself understandable as correctly as possible. So if I'm talking about the weekend, I've got to talk about the past tense. I'm not necessarily teaching it or expecting them to produce the past tense, but I speak the language as correct, like kind of like parents do. They don't go, oh, they're level one, their first year. I can only speak to them in present tense. They speak to them in all the tenses, and that way the natural selection actually happens where the brain acquires the language in the right order at the right time. So that's kind of how I interpret it. But I'm with you too. I do limit the exposure to the different forms. Like I am focusing on the I and the you in the beginning. They'll hear the he and the we as appropriate as they go along, but I am focusing on that because they get the more conversation. We do a lot of conversations and get that out of their way. But I teach present and past in level one simultaneously because you can't use the language if I can't speak the past tense. I can't. And I can use present tense to do the future because I can do the immediate future and use the present tense and sneak it in the future that way to get that in there before they actually learn the future tense, which is more common in most languages anyways. It
Mhm.
sounds too formal to use I will be going to the movies this weekend, or you know people say in French and in Spanish they say I'm going to go do something. In German we don't have that expression. It is I will do. There's no easier way to do that one. But I agree with you that there's some form of limitation there so that they can focus on one aspect or another. How about you, Tara?
I really struggled with answering this question because I thought, well, where does grammar appear in my class? So, two things. One is I do pop up grammar. I love grammar, of course. I think we all really love grammar.
Yeah.
We know it has its place in the world and probably not in our classrooms, but some of my kids really like the grammar. So I say, okay, we're doing grammar for 1 second. And I go, if this doesn't interest you, close your eyes, meditate, do whatever. But I'm going to just explain this to the people who want to learn it. And so that maybe you have it in your toolkit. And if it doesn't apply to you, it doesn't stick, no problem. So that's one thing. The pop-up grammar I found has been helpful, mostly for me because I just love it. The other thing is through songs. Every week we do a chanson de la semaine, and so we look at the title of the song and we look at the lyrics for meaning, but also structures. Because then they add them to their playlist. I try to get a wide range of genres and also places around the Francophone world represented. And so they put on their playlist, and then, they're singing the chorus. So through the pop-up grammar and the songs, I think that's kind of how the grammar gets into them, gets absorbed, I guess.
Yep. And
I
I
will
was
say that my students have figured out that if they want to totally derail my lesson, they ask me a grammar question because I absolutely love the history of language. And so I'll start going into Ladino and how Ladino found its way into Mexico and how the crypto Jews, and we start going. And suddenly 30 minutes of a 45-minute class has passed, and I'm still focused on explaining to them where the language came from. And another CI teacher posted this in Facebook, and I thought, this is my superpower answer. That is an amazing question, and it has an amazing backstory. Come to my office after school, and I'd be happy to share it with you.
awesome. Yeah,
I
that
was,
is so.
oh, it's so hard for me whenever they ask a question, and I started to realize that kids who can't even say a complete sentence were asking complex grammar questions because they could derail my lesson.
And for me, I use reading. I find that's where I find that grammar is taught best, because reading not only is a grammar instructor, it's also a vocab. Because Stephen Krashen says 70% of what you know in your language, whether it be your native language or any other language, comes from what you read. And it doesn't matter what you read, but that you read. Like, you'll have kids who say they can't learn vocabulary in English or in a second language, but know every car part. They can name every car part because they read car magazines and car part catalogs and stuff like that. And reading is nothing but examples of vocabulary and grammar and action. So they're seeing how it plays, so I can point it out during that. So that's kind of how I teach most of my grammar, is through reading. As we're reading, I will go, hey, do you notice this? Do you like the pop-up grammar that you're talking about? Do you notice that? I'll also ask them to kind of make up their own rule for something and see how close it is to the real rule. Because if they make up a rule for it, it's more ingrained in their brain than if I tell them a rule for it. So I'll be like, I'll put a whole bunch of adjectives and nouns together and have them, guess, be their detective. What do you think's going on here? Why is this? And then they come up with their own little ways. And sometimes they're brilliant ways and they're not wrong with doing that. They're coming up, they're not the exact grammar words that we would use or linguists would use, but they perfectly explain the rule in their own words. And I'm like, I'm stealing that. That's how I'm going to explain it from now on, because they hit that so well. So let's go ahead and end with, let's see here. What's your best advice for teachers worried that they'll get in trouble for not teaching grammar?
I had a conversation with my principal, actually did this conversation with this most recent job right in the interview. I was like, okay, if you don't know what comprehensible input is, let me just tell you about storytelling. I'm a storyteller and I tell all kinds of stories, and the kids learn to speak and read and write as we go along. I say I teach them just like they're in kindergarten, because guess what? They're in kindergarten for language. And so I said, I teach kindergarten language to eighth grade kindergarten Spanish speakers. And so I'm going to teach it like kindergarten, and just the same way the kindergarten teachers teach their kids language. So when you come into my classroom, you're going to hear it like kindergarten. And I said, you don't teach poetry and symbolic language in English to English speakers until the eighth grade. So I'm not going to teach it to them either. I'm going to teach them kindergarten language, and this is how it's going to look. And I give them, I have a beautiful picture on the side of the bus when I was living in Mexico that was Stephen Krashen all over it. It said, El que lee sin querer aprende sin querer. And which means he who reads without needing to learns without wanting to. So, and that's how I do it.
I think your point about reading is really important, and I actually have one of the novels that I teach. It's incredible what it does for students in terms of language acquisition and also confidence. Because after they complete this, they read a novel in French. And so if I am ever asked that question about grammar, and thank goodness I'm in an environment where that's not a question that's posed, but if I were asked, I would throw it back and say, tell me why you feel like grammar is essential to language learning. Because I'm teaching a language. To me, grammar is teaching about a language. And once I put that out there, it's like, okay, let me just think about that for a little bit. And it's really hard to continue the conversation after that. It is teaching about a language. When we're teaching communication, they don't need the specific grammar rules or the names or anything like that in order to communicate effectively. So why do they need to know it?
Absolutely. And I've got two things to finish us up here. The first is what I would say to them is, and I got this again from Blaine, and it's so true, that the average kid in a traditional classroom gets a C on grammar tests. On the explicit grammar test, it's an average of a C. And giving the same test to a TPRS or a CI student, an explicit grammar test, is a C as well. So you're not gaining anything or losing anything. They're getting about the same grade with instruction. But I'll give you a story about an interview I had for a job, and I'm going to tell it, and it's going to sound a little sarcastic, and obviously I'm going to be telling it a little bit more, colorfully than it actually happened in the thing, because in an interview you're much more toned down. But she asked me this question about how do I teach grammar in my classroom, and I said, well, I don't necessarily teach grammar. And she's like, you're a language teacher, how are you not teaching grammar? And so I asked her, I said, so what did you teach before you became a principal? Hoping she wasn't going to say science or math or something. She goes, English. I'm like, okay, great. This is going well. So I said, now, were you an English composition, grammar composition teacher, or were you an English literature teacher? Oh, no, I was the grammar composition teacher. So that's what I taught. I'm like, you falling right into my trap. So then I asked her, I said, then can you please conjugate for me in the pluscuamperfect the verb to be, the most common verb in the English language? And she goes and looks at me and she goes, I don't know what you're asking me to do. All 5 forms, I, you, he, she, we, they, please conjugate for me in the pluscuamperfect. The past perfect of the verb to be is, which is the most common verb in the English language. And she goes, I'm not getting what you're asking me. And I said, well, no offense to you or your education or what you taught, but this is a very common verb form in English. And you speak English beautifully. You speak English like a native speaker, but you can't conjugate for me in the pluscuamperfect, the past perfect, the most common verb in the English language. And I said, there's not even a trick to it. It doesn't change in all 5 forms. I had been, you had been, he or she had been, we had been, and they had been. And she goes, oh. I go, and you speak English fluently and beautifully, yet you can't conjugate for me. So you didn't learn the grammar of the English. And she goes, point taken, and cross that question off of her list. And so that's really the truth. Go to a native, walk up to someone in the mall and ask them these questions. They don't know them. And Spanish doesn't have this, but German does. And I don't know if French has it, but English and German both have it. They have an order to the adjectives. They have to go in a certain order. If they go out of order, they sound weird. German has it and English has it. I don't know if any of the Latin-based languages. I know Spanish does not have it. So if you hear it wrong, you know it's wrong. It just sounds weird. Like it's the big red dinosaur. You can't say the red big dinosaur. It sounds weird to say the red big dinosaur. We have this order, but ask any English teacher, including me, a native speaker of English, ask them if they know the order. We don't know the order. We just know what sounds right. But you can go to Google and look at it, and it will tell you what the order is. And the same thing in German. But we don't know it, but we can speak it fluently. And that's the whole point. We don't need to know the explicit grammar to be able to use the language. And I don't even think it necessarily helps. I think it hinders, because I told you about my Susie Gross rule, description versus action. And my level 2 students had it 80% correct. They could take an explicit imperfect preterite test and get 80% correct based off those two rules, period. But then I let the AP teacher, he says, the AP test was done. It's now the end of May, beginning of June. His kids have got nothing to do. He goes, will you let my kids come in and help your kids study for the final exam? I'm saying, of course, because I've got lots of grading I could be doing. So I did that, and they screwed up my kids because they taught them the imperfect preterite rules. The if the action starts in the past and goes to the, all those stupid ones that are in there, and they couldn't do the test that they did the week before the same. So I think grammar hinders at the beginning levels of language. When I say beginning levels, I mean all the levels we teach through high school, because our kids are not upper elementary kids in the native language, in the is equivalent to the native language that they're speaking. So a kid at 8 years old in Mexico or Spain or France or Quebec or Germany or Switzerland or wherever is not at the same spot that a 4-year language kid is, not even close. And we expect them to be at that same level or greater than that. The AP exam is measuring kids at 18 who've been speaking the language for 18 years. And I don't think it's fair to compare them with non-native speakers, but it's the exact same test wherever you take. The AP Spanish test is the same test worldwide, and same thing with the AP English test. Our kids are going to do better on the AP English test than a Hispanic or a French person would, because they've had more exposure to the language. But we can't equate it that way. And so grammar, I feel, isn't in the right place in those first 4 years. They haven't got to the level of fluency where we're working on polishing their language. We're still just working on getting that language out. And I think that's a much more important thing. And I think with CI, we can get them 80% of the way there and being accurate in their speech and in their writing. And that last 20% can come from explicit grammar instruction, but only once they've gotten to that 80% fluency rate already. I think it's something that comes post that fluency part, which is how we treat it in our native language. At least here in America, we do the same thing. It's upper elementary where they start teaching the actual explicit grammar. Do either of you have any final words before we end up today?
Just that I really have appreciated the freedom and the creativity that CI has brought to my teaching. I love the inclusiveness of the language, and I love the way CI is presented. When I was learning as a teacher, it made me feel seen and heard, even when I was doing a lot more poorly than I'm doing now. And I love when the students finally start putting it together that they actually can communicate. I had one student who was like, he came to me and he said, I'm not learning anything in your class. This is boring. This is stupid. I'm not learning anything. I said, what do you think you need to learn that you're not learning in my class? And he says, talking. I never talk. I said, have I given you opportunities to talk? He said, yeah. I said, do you talk when I ask you to talk? He says, no, it's boring. I said, okay, come by my office and let's have a conversation. Just you and me. Let's talk in Spanish. We talked for a half an hour straight. This is a Spanish 1 student that was 9 weeks into Spanish, and we talked for a half hour. Now, obviously, they were easy questions that had explicit answers, and I was scaffolding. But we had a back and forth conversation for 30 minutes. And at the end of that, I said, did you start my class knowing how to speak Spanish? He said, no. I said, do you feel now like you speak Spanish? And he said, yes. I said, okay, there we go.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all there is to it. You don't have to try so hard.
Yep, exactly. Anything you have to finish this up with, Tara?
Sure, just for people who are hesitant maybe about CI, about how to start small, start easy, start fun with something you love. Like I said, I started with story asking, not the way to go, but how about a picture talk or a movie talk? And I think the important part of all the choices you make in terms of content is to make them, as the CI word, compelling. They have to be interesting to the students. So I choose things with huge twists at the end, and every story that we tell always has a mais. Il y a un problème, or il y avait un problème, or il y a eu un problème, depending on the level and the tense. There was a problem, and then like, what is it? So now I just go mais, and the students know what to say after. Make it compelling and engaging, because you'll see that if you're having fun and you love it, the kids will too.
Awesome. Great advice. And with that, I want to say thank you to you both. It was an amazing talk today. I thank you so much for joining me on an early Sunday morning. At least it's early for me, Sunday morning here on the West Coast. Thank you so much. And if you guys have any questions, if you're watching this on the replay, feel free to reach out. You can put your questions in the comments on YouTube, or you can email us if you look on the show notes afterwards. If you are listening on a podcast app, is an email address where you can post your questions. And with that, I'll say goodbye for this week, and I will see you next week, 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. And with that, I'll leave everybody with our outro. Have a good rest of your week, everybody.